Hello, my name's Paul Gladston. I'm a professor of contemporary visual cultures and critical theory at the University of Nottingham in the UK. I've written widely about visual culture and contemporary art from the point of view of critical theory. I hope you enjoy this series on visual culture. Welcome to film 3 in this series on visual culture. In this film we'll be looking at the rise of aesthetic modernity in Europe at the end of the 18th century. We'll be looking at aesthetic modernity as a focus for social critique. We'll also be looking at the distinction between radical idealism and romanticism at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. In addition to that, we'll be looking at the distinction in artistic practice between romanticism and neoclassicism. Film 3, keywords: aesthetic modernity, radical idealism, romanticism, neoclassicism, neo-Gothic. Another defining aspect of Western visual culture is the idea of aesthetic modernity. This is the idea that somehow aesthetic experience can actually be a focus for criticism and social criticism as well as cultural criticism. This is an idea that develops very much through the 17th and 18th century, but becomes crystallized at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Pivotal in this is Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy, or instituting of the critical philosophy. And in that, Kant makes a distinction between three realms or areas of criticality. One of them is in relation to practical reason, the other in terms of ethics or morality, and the other in relation to judgment, which includes aesthetics, that's to say, ways of thinking about aesthetic experience and how we feel in front of nature and in front of art. Key to Kant's outlook is the idea that somehow that aesthetic experience can mediate between practical and moral reason. Practical and moral reason, in his terms, are things that are kind of resistant to one another, that can't really be made to interact with one another directly, that we can follow a practical line without necessarily being moral, and vice versa. Aesthetic experience is seen as something that can allow us to bring the two together, that can give us a sense of how the practical can be moral, and that we can have a progressive, more modern society on the basis of this kind of mediation. In Europe at the end of the 18th century, there's an increased focus on aesthetics as a separate branch of philosophy, although philosophical ideas about aesthetic experience had been developed in antiquity. They really become a separate branch of thinking around about the end of the 18th century as part of the Enlightenment. And the two parts of aesthetic experience that are generally dealt with at this time are the ideas of beauty and ideas of sublimity. Now, beauty is something that's very much attached to classical style and the kind of ideas that we attach to classical style. Beauty is in proportion. It's something that can be perceived in its totality. It's something that gives rise to feelings of pleasure. Classical art is very much seen as beautiful in that respect. However, during antiquity, there were also discussions of something which comes to be discussed as the sublime. The sublime is really an aesthetic feeling which first involves pain and then pleasure. It involves perceptual objects that are not necessarily complete, are not proportionate. In the 18th century, there's a much greater emphasis than there had been during antiquity on ideas of the sublime. These are first developed by a British thinker, Edmund Burke, who describes the sublime as being in the face of something which is strange or unusual or beyond our usual kind of powers of perception and reason, that makes us feel uncertain and even kind of brings about certain feelings of pain. Immanuel Kant takes these ideas a little bit further, and he kind of imputes a certain sense of reason to the experience of the sublime. So We might be in the face of something that's so big that we can't comprehend it, or something that's so powerful that it threatens to destroy us. But in facing that thing and facing the fears or the feelings of fear and pain that come along with those kinds of experiences, we can, as Immanuel Kant says, project a sense of our own kind of moral worth and our own moral reason as human subjects, overcoming those feelings of pain ultimately with feelings of pleasure. It's those aesthetic experiences, and not least the sublime, which are seen as pivotal to the way that in the modern world we think about the bringing together of practical and moral reason. And since the end of the 18th century, since the post-Enlightenment period, there have been, and we'll see throughout this series of films, a kind of succession of ways of thinking about aesthetic experience according to different concerns at different times in history that allow it to be seen in this kind of moral critical way. And indeed, we still tend to think, in a westernized sense, of aesthetic experience, and not least visual culture, as having that capacity. The modern and contemporary art world of our own time is one which is very much seen as a focus for moral and moral criticism of society and looking towards a better, more progressive society. What emerges in relation to the development of aesthetic modernity at the end of the 18th century are competing ways of thinking about modernity. One is associated with what we might refer to as radical idealism, and the other with romanticism. These are kind of tendencies which, in a sense, have continued all the way as part of Western visual culture through to the present day, as we'll see in other films. It's part of that kind of dialectical opposition and generational disaffinity that we were talking about earlier in relation to the Gothic and the classical. In this case, there's a kind of renewed opposition between a certain idea of the classical and a certain idea, to some extent, of the Gothic itself, as we'll see towards the end of this film. Radical idealism is a kind of reworking of some of the ideas associated with classicism during antiquity and also during the Renaissance. This idea of a kind of transcendental ideal, something beyond the ordinary. Radical idealism during the 18th century looks towards a kind of ideal moral order as a kind of basis for changes in society, a kind of modernizing society along those sort of principles. Of course, it projects a certain kind of conservatism because it's very much based on the ideas in antiquity of some kind of proportion and reason and stability. And a lot of the ideas that we see associated with Western culture during the Enlightenment very much have those kinds of roots. But radical idealism, which is something that continues well into the 19th century amongst philosophers thinking about the aesthetic, you see ideal beauty as a kind of metaphor, if you like, for the way that society and also individuals within society might be able to develop in sort of more progressive modern ways. The foil to that is romanticism. If classicism, even radical idealizing classicism, still has a sense of proportion and limitation, the romantic is pretty much the opposite. It looks towards the possibility of a transformed society based on a lack of conformity to limits, a kind of crossing over limitations, both in broader social terms and in terms of individual experience. Romanticism's idea of a disregard for limits is something that we can see very much associated with the idea of the sublime as a aesthetic feeling which doesn't have a strict sense of proportion or limitation. The ideal in idealizing beauty, on the other hand, very much upholds the idea of limitations and proportion and structure. Nevertheless, although they're both opposed to one another in aesthetic terms, one radical idealism being associated with the beautiful and romanticism with the sublime, they're both looking pretty much towards the same kinds of outcomes in general terms. It's the notion of a breaking with the past and the formation of a new, more progressive society. So although romanticism and radical idealism might be seen as strongly opposed to one another in terms of the ideas of dialectical opposition that we discussed in the last film, one very much associated, radical idealism, with the aesthetic of the beautiful and romanticism with the aesthetic of the sublime, they're both looking towards similar outcomes and possibilities. That's to say, radical transformations in society, modernizing transformations in society. Both of these things are very much characteristic of Enlightenment and most certainly post-Enlightenment developments as part of Western culture during the late 18th and 19th century. And as we'll see, can be seen to have transformed themselves and become continuous aspects of the way we think about Western visual culture, even right to the present day. So how can we look at these very abstract philosophical ideas in practical terms? How do we see them as expressed as part of visual culture during the late 18th and early 19th century? Well, one important aspect of the development of aesthetic modernity in Europe at the end of the 18th century was in England in relation to architecture and also garden design. Edmund Burke's ideas about the sublime and the beautiful were translated into architectural form and garden design form at that time. The architect Sir William Chambers, for example, designed structures for Kew Gardens in London, which very much followed these differing aesthetic moods which are suggested by the beautiful and the sublime. In Kew Gardens, and you can still see remnants of this today, there's kind of classical ruins which were put there by Chambers, but also a kind of Chinese-style pagoda, which doesn't strictly follow Chinese architectural designs, but kind of evokes a kind of exotic, oriental architecture. The pagoda at Kew Gardens is very much an expression of the sublime, in opposition, in a sense, or in contrast to the classical ruins that Chambers designed for Kew Gardens. And this is a very important aspect of the development of Romanticism at the end of the 18th century into the early 19th century. It's not only philosophically an attitude which looks beyond the idea of limits, but that looking beyond limits also extends to some of the experiences that were developing in Europe in relation to the extension of European trade around the world and the initial development of European colonialism, not least into Asia and East Asia. Chambers, for example, had actually visited China as a worker for the Swedish East India Company in the 18th century. So his architectural designs, Chinese architectural designs, are based at least in part on some expansive cultural experience, direct cultural experience that he was able to have as part of Western colonialism at the time. Reports coming back from other parts of the world as part of colonialism very much informed thinking in areas of decorative garden design, architectural design in Europe. As early as the 17th century, ideas of an Oriental, Chinese, Japanese aesthetic garden design started to filter into the literature in Europe based on reports, not least from Jesuit missionaries. And these were very much picked up and used in Europe as part of garden design, not just by Chambers at Kew, but in Germany and other parts of Europe. key example, though, I think, in terms of seeing the development of radical idealism and romanticism in practical terms, are two buildings that can still be seen in London today. One is the Neo-Palladian villa at Chiswick, that was built in the mid-18th century, designed very much along classical lines, and a slightly later building, Strawberry Hill House, which is one of the first neo-Gothic architectural designs that was developed in the 18th century in Europe. Both of those buildings have very different political meanings attached to them. The kinds of ideas of stability and proportion associated with the Neo-Palladian villa at Chiswick very much express conservative or Tory political views in England at the time, whereas Strawberry Hill House is a kind of rejoinder to that, a kind of architectural and political rejoinder, one that expresses more expansive liberal attitudes associated with Whig politics. These kind of opposing political visions, very much symbolised by different approaches to garden design and architectural design in England at the time. What this develops is the idea that the aesthetic can have a political, critical meaning. This is something which is very much characteristic of the development of Western visual culture after the 18th century, and something which continues to inform the way we think about visuality even up until the present day. To summarize, in this film we've looked at the idea of aesthetic modernity, that's the idea of aesthetic experience as a focus for progressive criticism of society. We've also looked at opposing or differing philosophical positions related to radical idealism and romanticism. And we've also looked at the way that these things are expressed in visual terms in architecture and garden design, not least in relation to Neo-Palladian architecture in London in the 18th century and the emergence of a neo-Gothic architecture at the same time. On reflecting on the content of this film, it might be interesting for you to think about the ways in which classical style and the ideas attached to classical style and Gothic style and some of the ideas that have been attached to that, how they actually still impact on our lives today. An example might be Goth culture or Gothic culture that we're very much used to in terms of music and films. Perhaps you can think of some other examples. Let me enlighten you about the next lecture. Next time we're going to be talking about the avant-garde.